Now, an international panel of scientists is raising questions about whether there's a link between cell phones and cancer. Jeffrey Brown has the story.
The news led to provocative headlines, all triggered by an announcement from a panel of the World Health Organization. A team of 31 scientists from 14 countries said radiation emitted by cell phones is, quote, possibly carcinogenic and may be associated with some risk for brain cancer. But the group also said that evidence of a direct link is still far from clear, and it called for more study. A cell phone industry group put out a statement that today's news does not mean cell phones cause cancer. So to walk through what is and is not known, we're joined by Dr. Keith Black, Chair of Neurosurgery and Neuroscience at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Dr. Black, welcome to you. So what does possibly carcinogenic mean exactly?
But what it means is that, the World Health Organization panel of scientists looked at the current available evidence that's been published, as well as some unpublished data that should be coming out shortly from the Interpol, which is a multinational study, and concluded that the evidence suggests that there is a possible link between cell phone use and brain cancer. This is looking at multiple studies, but the best conclusion at this point would suggest that there is the possibility for a link.
Now, the issue is the radiation, right? Explain what researchers are concerned about and what they're studying.
So essentially, a cell phone is a microwave antenna which generates microwave radiation. And we know that microwave radiation can penetrate into the brain when you hold the cell phone next to your ear. In fact, is related to the square of the distance. So the closer, you get a much greater amount of radiation going into the brain. That radiation energy, when it hits biological tissues, there is some concern that it may actually cause cells over a long-term time period to transform from normal cells into cancer cells.
Well, to be clear now, this is a shift for the WHO, but as I said in the introduction, at the same time, researchers said that they have not found a direct link so far. So tell us, what is it that we don't know, and what makes this hard to make a direct link?
So what we don't know currently is whether cell phone use is safe, and we don't know that it's unsafe. The problem that we have is that about half of the studies have shown that there's no correlation to brain cancer and cell phone use, and half of the studies that have been done have shown a correlation. The problem that we have is that the studies that tend to show no correlation tend to be studies that look at people that have had very short time periods of cell phone use and very low amounts of minutes of using the cell phone. The studies that do show a correlation tend to be studies that have looked at people that have used cell phones for a period of 10 years, for example, and are using cell phones, say, for 30 minutes a day, higher term use. So the longer term studies, the studies that have been somewhat better designed, although still flawed, have tended to show this correlation. The problem we have is that we know that most environmental agents that cause cancer don't cause cancer after a month or a year or 2 years of exposure. The best example I can give to illustrate this is that if one was to start smoking cigarettes when they were 12, we don't expect them to develop lung cancer when they're 22. We expect them to develop lung cancer when they're 42 or 52, 3 or 4 decades of exposure. We just don't have that long period of study with people that have used cell phones.
Well, so of course people wonder what they should do, and this group did not propose guidelines or regulations. As to advice to consumers, I noted that one of the researchers said, pending the availability of additional research, it is important to take pragmatic measures to reduce exposure, such as hands-free devices or texting. So fill in that picture for us. What advice would you give people, given what we know and what we don't know?
So, the best thing is to be informed. I think the best thing for consumers and the best thing about the WHO statement is that at least consumers can be aware that there is a potential risk, and therefore they can begin to sort of take measures to use the cell phone more safely. Even if you read the insert in the cell phone, it'll tell you to hold the cell phone, an inch or so away from your ear so that the radiation doesn't go directly into the brain. Best to use an earpiece, best to use it on speaker mode, best to use text. If you're driving, best to use hands-free, and not to put the cell phone, right adjacent to your brain. The other thing to be aware of is that we haven't had any good studies in the pediatric population. A child's skull is much thinner, the scalp is much thinner, and the amount of radiation that goes into the pediatric brain is much higher than in the adult. So we should be cautious with how we allow our children to use a cell phone. They're going to be the ones not only using it at a much younger age, but using it over a much longer duration.
And just I'm sorry. No, just briefly, I can't resist asking you, Dr. Black, what about you yourself? You use a cell phone, or does this change how you see it?
No, I use a cell phone, but I always use it either on speaker mode or use it with an earpiece or text. I don't put it next to my brain. I think to also just to put this in context for your viewers, the risk of developing brain cancer is about 6 per 100,000 in a population per year. So even if the risk were to double, you're looking at about 12 cases per 100,000 in the population. It doesn't mean that we're going to be walking down the streets and people are going to be falling over dying of brain cancer. The overall number of people that develop brain cancer is not like lung cancer or breast cancer. It's a little smaller. But what's important to recognize is that if you do develop brain cancer, it's one of the most devastating illnesses that you can have. So if you want to take precautions, at least you're aware that your cell phone is not necessarily a safe device, and using the things that we've outlined.
Okay.
Earpiece, speaker mode, can be a safer way of using it.
All right, Dr. Keith Black, thanks so much. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
How many of you have an iPhone? You got to legal? All right. Now click on RF exposure. Now you can read it later, but it's basically telling you that you need to know, don't keep the phone in your pocket or you will exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines. Now, how many of you knew that before today? Because they actually are now giving people this information. Telstra is telling you to use a hands-free device to keep a mobile phone away from the head and body, because mobile phones and Wi-Fi devices emit pulsed microwave radiation. 900 times a minute, it's looking for a signal. It says to the tower, where are you? Here I am. Where are you? Here I am. It's smart. That's how it's supposed to do. Now, when the phone rings, the worst time for you to put a phone right next to your head is when you answer it and say hello, because it's smart and it goes to max power. And bone marrow, and look here at the radiation as it gets into the groin area. And that's just from having a mobile phone modeled into the pocket. The United States magazine Consumer Reports recently recommended that nobody keep a phone in their pocket. Nobody. And in fact, if phones were tested in pockets, they would exceed the as-tested exposure guidelines, which is why Telstra has recently issued that advice. iPads and other devices are called tablets because they belong on tables. They are tested 20 centimeters away from that big guy that I showed you before. 20 centimeters away. They are not approved to be held in the laps of little children. The problem we face is that right now, we're in the midst of an experiment on my grandchildren and your children. This is showing you cellular damage that occurred in animals that were prenatally exposed to mobile phone radiation. So these animals basically had significant damage to their liver if they had been exposed prenatally compared to controls. Another group in Turkey has looked at prenatal effects on the brain and the testis. They looked at newborn rats after they had been exposed prenatally and compared those who were exposed to those who were not exposed. And they looked at their brain cells, the number of cells, their shape, etc., with established methods for testing this. And this article was published in Brain Research, which is a relatively high-impact journal. And what they showed was that prenatally exposed newborns have basically fewer cells in the hippocampus. Here's the exposed, missing some cells, and here are the controls, which they're compared with. And what they found was that newborns that had been exposed took 3 times as long to find their way out of an experimental maze and made twice as many errors. Studies have been done here in Australia at Newcastle by a fellow who's now the pro-chancellor of the university. And these studies have been done taking sperm from healthy men. And one test tube gets exposed to cell phone radiation, and one test tube is not exposed to mobile phone radiation. And then the results are evaluated. And this is a measure of vitality. We measure how well the sperm swim. This is a measure of motility. This is a measure of mitochondrial DNA damage. They have 3 times as much damage on their DNA. But taking middle-aged rats, 70-day-old male rats, that's middle age for a rat, and exposing them 2 hours a day for 45 days to a computer-generated mobile phone signal. And those results show lower testosterone, which is a very important hormone for a male. Men and women both have testosterone. Men just need a lot more of it. And also increases of DNA damage as measured by certain enzymes. And the offspring had lower fertility. Has anyone seen a woman put a cell phone in her bra? Hands up, please. Please tell them you've heard now why they shouldn't do that. And here I want to show you our first case report from 2009, and we now have many more. This was a Chinese-American woman who used her cell phone 4 hours a day in her bra for 10 years while she was driving. Now, and you drive with a phone on your body. The phone is smart. It's going to go from one tower to another, and it's going to say, here I am, where are you, here I am. And it's going to be going to max power each time it moves from one cell tower to another. And there it was right next to her chest. And the tumors that developed right under the antenna of the phone. And it was subcutaneous, so it's like right under the surface of the skin. All right? Prenatally exposed mice have hyperactivity as adults. And these are some of the data. They have worse memory, they're more hyperactive, they have more anxiety, but they don't have much fear. The World Health Organization had reviewed all of the evidence and decided that mobile phone radiation was a possible human carcinogen. How many people had heard that? If people started to use phones regularly before age 20, as most of the world is doing now, there was 4 to 8 times more brain cancer after they had passed 10 years. So now, why is there no increase in brain cancer that we can find in the general population today? Because there is not. And after all, if mobile phones really are important, why don't we have an epidemic today? Well, let me tell you why. First of all, brain cancer takes a long time to develop. How do we know that? We know that because when the bombs fell at the end of World War II, there was no increase in brain cancer in the survivors who had been studied. No increase at all. Until 40 years had passed. It took 40 years for an increase in brain cancer to show up in that highly exposed population. In fact, most epidemiologic studies find no increased risk of brain cancer from mobile phone radiation. They don't. Until 10 years of heavy use. And by the way they define a cell phone user in these studies, I'm not making this up, is somebody who makes 1 call a week for 6 months. Yes, yes. And there's a tremendous amount of sponsored research by people who are hired to do studies to find no effect. And that's plagued this field. In the United States today, the gentleman who is directing the Federal Communications Commission, Tom Wheeler, was for 10 years the executive director of the Cell Phone Telecommunications Industry Association. In 1994, when industry first became aware that there were studies suggesting that mobile phone radiation could damage brain cells of rats, a memo was written to, quote, war-game the science. War-game the science. Israel, which is a country that has a lot of important issues to deal with right now, has a National Institute on Non-Ionizing Radiation. They say no Wi-Fi in kindergarten. They all prefer wired over wireless in schools. The Canadian Parliamentary Health Committee has urged that there be a recognition that this is a, quote, serious public health issue. Vodafone has to provide a report to the American government, and they report that they face risks because they may have to pay people for health damages. China Mobile, in their report to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, they had to say, we cannot be certain that future studies will not impute a link between electromagnetic fields and adverse health effects. Think about this. That microwave oven, it works because there's a metal box around a microwave signal, and the signal pings all over the place. Next time you get into an elevator or a train for any length of time, put your phone on airplane mode. Otherwise, that signal is going all over the place, magnifying and coming back. Keep the mobile phone away from you when it's on and you are asleep.